purpose of the recording, I've introduced the aims and goals of the workshop. For everyone else now in the workshop, hopefully you see a slide in front of you with the outline. So we're maybe 5 minutes into an introduction from me. So I'm going to continue in this introduction and just talk a little bit about the R Validation Hub and background. Then I'll get onto the white paper and we'll spend 20 minutes or so looking at that. In the midst of all this, we'll also have a poll. So very soon we'll get you to get your fingers on the keyboards and let us know about your background and how you're looking to use R today. We'll have a very early break for the workshop of 10 minutes, and that's mainly because the workshop really splits most neatly into two pieces. The first of which Marley's going to take you through, which is around the risk assessment tools. And then following a risk assessment, the next phase in the process, as outlined in the white paper, is responding to risk or testing, if you will. And I'll take us through that. So I'll have a break between those and a break just before. So not too long till your first break of the day. Okay. So for anyone who's not heard of the R Validation Hub, we have a fairly lengthy mission statement, but basically what we're trying to do is enable the use of R within our industry, so within the biopharmaceutical industry, with a particular focus on using R in a regulatory context, so GXP context. The group was formed a couple of years ago, in fact, just before the first R and Pharma conference in 2018. A group that people will know in Europe, PSI, so statisticians, programmers in Europe, certainly in the UK, are normally members of either PSI or FSPI, the European equivalent of that group. And through the aims, applications and implementation of methodologies in statistics, special interest group, we had the AIMSIG had an interest in using R and promoting the use of R throughout industry. And the first challenge we identified was this whole question around validation and the use of R and what was actually required. There were a lot of unknowns. So we set about trying to answer that question. We set up a group to look at that. We applied for funding through the R Consortium. Were provided that funding, and we were set up as an R Consortium working group. And following a workshop just like this in the first R Pharma conference and lots of conversations that I had at that conference, we expanded rapidly, and we now have around about 100 members from multiple organizations, including regulatory bodies, pharmaceutical companies, and CROs. And some of the names that you can see here are the sort of executive committee that come together on a monthly basis at the moment to discuss the direction, provide impact on the various, provide input on the various streams that are ongoing within the R Validation Hub. I'll come back to this at the very end of the workshop, but I've just put a few resources up there. If you've not come across it before, there's a link in the slides you can follow to go to our web page. You can Google R Validation Hub and it should get you there pretty quickly as well. On there, we release regular blog posts. You get previous presentations, so last year's workshop, this year's workshop will be available there. The white paper that we're basing this workshop on is also available from there, and various links to other resources as well. We have an equivalent GitHub organization, which you can find links to some of the other tools that are going to be talked about later, risk metric R package and the risk assessment app. If you are interested, again, we'll put this back up at the end, but if you're interested, you can either join us and get active and help us build some of these tools by emailing this address, or there's a mailing list which you can also join if you just want to keep abreast of what's going on in the group. Okay, at this point, before we get too deep, I said you're going to get your fingers onto some keyboards. So Marley's going to set up a poll for us. All we want to do is just understand what it is you are either using R, or how you're using R today, or how you plan to use R in the future. So there's 5 different options in this, ranging from we're already using R, and this workshop is just so we can see what everyone else is doing, through to you've attended the wrong workshop and you have no intent on using R in a regulatory setting at all.
Let me share the results.
Thank you. That is the only poll we have planned as well. So for those of you who haven't been able to access that, don't worry, it's not going to affect your workshop. Okay. So no presentation on R and the use of R within the pharmaceutical industry would be complete without a screenshot of the FDA's statistical software clarifying statement from 2015. So this one indeed is not not complete without it. So I've included this in here. The key point here, for those of you who might not be aware of this already, that with respect to 21 CFR Part 11, which is an FDA document governing electronic records and signatures primarily, they point out that R, or statistical analysis software generally, is not explicitly discussed in that, and point to the ICH E9 guidance below, which again just says that the statistical software should be reliable and documentation of appropriate software testing procedures should be available. One of the reasons why this is always highlighted is not just to look at the FDA perspective and or the ICH perspective, but just to highlight that really there isn't a whole bunch of information out there on exactly what to do when it comes to statistical software. You can look at the same kind of information coming from the EMA as well. And indeed, if I flick to the next slide, you can see a bunch of different resources that have been used both in compiling this workshop and in compiling the white paper upon which this workshop is based. And nowhere does it explicitly, apart from where I've just mentioned in that statistical software clarifying statement, nowhere does it explicitly mention statistical software. So all this documentation relates to validation of computer systems, but it is a bit of an unknown, and we are to some extent breaking ground, even though most of you will already be using at least one other well-known commercial software for statistical analysis already. One that is worth highlighting, particularly if any of you have been on came on the workshop last year or have attended presentations prior to April this year, is that in April this year the EMA released these two documents here, and we'll mention some of the key things within those documents later on in the workshop. But these two are fairly new if you look at those. So let's start with some definitions, and the key ones I mentioned: validation, qualification, verification. That document, that EMA document from April this year, provides probably the clearest definition I've seen from any regulator. Apologies to Paul, I can see here from joining us from the FDA, and anyone else who works for any other regulatory bodies. For me, that's the clearest definition I've seen. And if you are looking at my screen and reading this at the moment and still don't think it's that clear, well, it's not necessarily super clear. And so what I've done is I've come to extracted my interpretation and understanding of those documents, and these are some definitions that we're going to work with on this workshop. So I appreciate that within different organizations, you're all going to interpret this slightly differently. You might have your own definition of validation qualification that you follow, but for this workshop, we're going to stick with these definitions. So that is that verification, generally, if we're talking about that, we're generally referring to what I've called here single-use pieces of code. So that might be if I write some R code or some SAS code or some Python code to draw a graph or create a table, and somebody else comes and checks that, they come through and they either do a code review or they independently program that output. That's verification of the results. Okay. We might also use verification to talk about things like unit testing, but it's a very specific check of a result. Qualification and validation generally go hand in hand, and with respect to what the kinds of tests we might write for software, there's not a huge amount of difference. Essentially, you qualify a piece of software by checking that it meets its expectations. So it does what it claims to do. That's the key check. Validation then is about not just checking that the software does what it claims to do, but it works for you in the way that you're going to use it. So when you use that software in line with your SOPs, it meets your expectations and requirements. So in addition to qualification, validation will factor in things like user training. It will factor in access control relating to that user training, things like an audit trail and other security measures to ensure compliance with the software. Compliance with your SOPs. And in that sense, you can almost think of this as kind of hierarchical. So you've got verification, sort of individual test, qualification of a system to make sure the whole system performs as expected, and then validation on top of that, extra security checks and so on that we're going to put in place to ensure that it works within that GXP context. Okay. And this next slide has got a few examples of the sorts of things that we'll be talking about, therefore, using those definitions. So some of these I've just mentioned, but for example, you might validate a controlled workflow environment. So hopefully most people in this industry are familiar with the term statistical computing environment. So that will be a controlled application commonly used for clinical reporting. So that's something you're going to log into. You have an audit trail. You're going to run click buttons potentially that run processes that or run scripts that process data sets or analyze data sets and produce results. That kind of controlled environment, because you're logging into it and working with data, is the kind of thing you might validate. Equally, you might build an application, for example, a Shiny app, and decide to use that as part of a regulatory workflow. And in that case, you might look to validate that application as well. But things like languages, SAS, R, Python, and so on, are the kinds of things we're going to talk about qualifying. So that's the context in which we're going to work through this workshop. I don't want to dwell on this because whether you talk about validating R, qualifying R, however you talk about it, the essence is the same. And we'll talk about this in the white paper with respect to accuracy. The challenge is to ensure that the software does what it's supposed to. So whatever you call it, if you agree or don't agree with these definitions, to an extent, it doesn't matter. These are the definitions we're going to work with, and these are the ones that are throughout they're used throughout the documentation that I referred to on an earlier slide. But really, this is about ensuring that R meets your expectations. Okay. So with that, hopefully that explains partly why we have such a title for our white paper. So I'm really pleased to say that Paolo and John, who co-wrote the white paper with me, are on the call today as well, and will be joining us in some of the breakout rooms later. We wrote the white paper on behalf of the R Validation Hub and released it in, I think, January this year, certainly earlier on this year, in response to about a year's worth of thinking on the subject of validation and how you might use R within a validated infrastructure. So the assumption is you're using some kind of SCE, or you're going to build an app, and the R is going to be qualified sitting in the back end of that app. Okay. In the white paper, we put it in the title, and we talk about a risk-based approach throughout the white paper. And I've just put up a couple of reasons why. So this is from the FDA and the EMA, two quotes from different links that I put up earlier that both mention a documented risk assessment. And that's why we're going down this, or one of the main reasons why we're going down this route. We are proposing that you risk assess individual R packages before deciding what to do next. And this whole workshop is based around that risk assessment process. And when Marley starts talking in a bit, she's going to lead you through that risk assessment piece. Okay. So in the white paper, to anchor down our thoughts, we start by looking at the FDA's definition of validation. Okay, and we break that down into three components. accuracy, reproducibility, and traceability. To an extent, the reproducibility, if you consider writing tests, rerunning those tests, reproducing the same results is something that's very relatively easy to verify once you have them. And traceability is something that you can control through your standards, your standard processes within your companies. So the focus really, as I mentioned a couple of slides back, is on accuracy for the white paper. How do we ensure that the R packages we use are accurate and correct for what we need to use them for? And that's the real challenge, and that's hence the focus of the white paper. Before I get into that, and as we do in the white paper, we provide a little bit of clarification around what we mean by R. Hopefully, if you signed up to this workshop, one of the prerequisites was that you had a reasonable understanding of the R package ecosystem. So just to recap at a high level, the kind of minimal level that you would need to know to approach this. When you go to CRAN and you download R, what you actually download is, to my knowledge, still 29 core packages, and they are made up of what are called the base packages and the recommended packages. So the base packages will be things like the base package itself. There'll be things like methods, stats, and so on. And then the recommended packages will be things like the survival package that sits in that distribution as well. And if you are new to this space and you're looking at using R for the first time in that GXP context, then in addition to all of those other regulatory documents that I pointed you to earlier, I really recommend you follow this link in the slide and read this paper by the R Foundation. And that describes their approach to developing the R language. It talks about everything from the qualifications of those who use R, through their testing approach, how they release versions ahead of time for beta testing and so on. All of that is covered within that document. And by and large, if you read that document, you would see that most people would tend to agree that the R core team, when they control R in much the same way as any kind of commercial software that you might buy in this space. Okay, so you can read that, and I would challenge anyone to come out of having read that with a view that R is anything other than low risk. And we'll talk about a little bit later what low risk might mean in terms of what you do next. But certainly base R, the recommended package, is pretty well controlled. Where there is obviously variable risk is in all of the other 15,000 or however many packages there are on CRAN these days, because they can be produced by anybody, and they're going to have varying software development life cycles. Some may have tests, some may not. Some may do what they claim to, some may not. There's a lot of unknowns in those packages. And that's why we're proposing a risk-based approach to establish, once you get one of those R packages, if someone in your organization wants to use one, what steps can you take to start to assess the risk of those packages? Okay. One clear distinction we make in the white paper, which I think is really important because this is a question that we get asked, or I certainly get asked a lot, is about imports and dependencies. So to take a really well-known R package in dplyr, if you install dplyr today, you'll find that you get, I don't know, 50 other R packages installed alongside dplyr. There's a lot of dependencies. Certainly pick any tidyverse package and you'll find there's a lot of dependencies that also get installed. Now that's actually generally good practice. You're using dependencies, you're not duplicating code. That's absolutely fine. But the question often comes up, well, do I need to test those dependencies? Do I need to put in all the same rigor for those dependencies as the main package that I'm interested in, which is dplyr? And to anyone who asks me, I always point them towards the definitions around validation, and in particular, the point that packages, in a validation approach, you are talking about how you are intending to use those packages and tools. So if you were building an application, it would have buttons potentially that you're going to press and expected workflows that will take you through that application. Those are the kinds of things you're testing in the front end from a user perspective. You are not generally in that workflow testing those functions underneath, because that's not how you're expected to use the system. You're not expected to open it up and start hacking away underneath it. You're expected to use it in a particular way. So if you install dplyr, the intention is that you're going to use dplyr. You're not going to use those other packages. Okay. It might be that you therefore want to put some checks in place within your organizations to make sure that people aren't using those other packages. But certainly the focus should very much be on the packages that you intend to use and not the imports, the back ends. In the same way that you wouldn't focus on the operating system other than recording what it is, and so on. And similarly with C libraries and all the other things that sort of sit in the back end of your R packages. Those are kinds of things that are important to know about, and it might be important from a risk perspective to look at, check to make sure you're not importing viruses and that kind of thing. But from a user's perspective and from an accuracy perspective, what you're interested in is the package that you're actually loading via a library call. Okay. So once we've decided that we want to use a package, the next step that we proposed is to assess the package based on 4 criteria. Now, the bottom 3 are mainly what Marley's going to cover after our break. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the purpose before briefly mentioning the maintenance, the community usage, and the testing before we take that break, and then Marley will pick that up with the risk assessment afterwards. So in this context, when we're talking about purpose, it is assumed that any package that we're talking about is intended to be used within a GXP workflow, so to be used to generate output that we're going to submit to a regulatory body. And by that I mean directly manipulating data or creating a graphic or running a statistical model that forms part of that submission. So we probably don't mean things like dev tools that are used to build our packages and others. But if you want, you can extend this slightly further and you can include that. So the first question in purpose is it going to be part of my regulatory workflow or is it not? Assuming that it is going to be part of your regulatory workflow, then in a sense, everything has equal weight. Getting something wrong in data manipulation is as important, if not more important, than a statistical model producing exactly the right results. Because if you feed the wrong data in, it doesn't matter if the model is accurate. However, we do make the distinction between statistical and non-statistical in the paper, and we do also list out some of those other classifications you might have: packages for graphics, packages for loading data, and so on and so forth. But the reason why we think statistical modeling packages deserve a little bit of extra attention is the difficulty with which you can identify errors in those packages. So if, again, going back to my example of dplyr, if you wanted to check the filter commands, you could feed it quite a simple data set, and you could check that you have that if you run that filter command, that it has returned the rows that you expect it to return. Even in practice, if you're using this on clinical trial data and you want to check that you can correctly filter out the subjects that are not part of the ITT population, it's still relatively easy to verify as a human to go through and look and check that the right subjects have been included and the right subjects have been excluded. Okay, and you can easily check it using other software as well if you wanted to. Okay, what is harder is statistical models, because if you get running a human being looking at the output from a statistical model, you can tell by looking at a graph of the data whether the model is approximately right, but you're not going to get that to the x decimal place, the 3rd or 4th decimal place. I would challenge anyone to, even in a linear model, which is fairly straightforward, to figure out whether that is exactly right or not for a reasonably large data set. So that's where there's an extra challenge. And we actually put a statement in the white paper that says tests should be written for all statistical modeling functions if you're intending to use them, regardless of the risk assessment. And that's something that we'll challenge again later in the testing section. Okay, as I said, I will be handing over, we'll take a break in a second, and then we'll hand over to Marley to go through this in detail. But why do we think maintenance, testing, and community usage are important? And why are we collecting those? Well, if a package is out there in the open source, it does matter. Things like community usage does matter, because even if the package has no tests, if it's been around for 20 years and it's popular and used, that is an indication of some level of testing in that community. Packages don't tend to become popular packages if they don't work. So there's lots of steps, lots of metrics you can collect around the usage of packages, the number of downloads, you can collect the responsiveness of the author to user documentation that give you an idea as to how well a package is maintained and how well tested it is by a user community. And all these things, if we know about them, can help reduce risk potentially. And that's the essence of what we're talking about with a risk assessment, and what Marley will talk about later. Just before we do take a break, I just want to draw your attention to this within the white papers. This is our workflow. Essentially, what we're talking about in this workshop is the process of gathering the information in this middle row as a risk assessment, and then the process of addressing that risk assessment through remediation and testing. So new package here refers to some package I want to install as part of my system and then allow people to use for GXP work. I classify it. In that case, the way I've described it, it would be intended for use. Okay. Everything else that it imports becomes heads down this route, and we just do some minimum checks. But for the main package that we're interested in, we start looking at the purpose. Is it statistical? Is it non-statistical? Is it maintained? Is it widely used? And all this gives us an idea of the risk of the package. And if we have doubts, then as you can see in here, the implication is that we go and develop tests for this. And I think from when we wrote the paper to now, the only thing that's probably changed slightly, in my opinion, is I think it's very difficult to write, as this diagram implies, specific tests relating to the purpose or specific tests relating to the maintenance. I think generally you ask all of these three questions in one go, and then based on all that information collectively, define requirements and tests that you want to develop before heading back up here. So this really is kind of one pool at the bottom of remediation/testing. Otherwise, I think that's this still works very much today, and that's what we're going to talk about after the break. Okay, that's it for me now. Marley's going to pick up just after the break. I'll start the timer now. Marley, I'll hand over to you to take us forward for the next piece.
These are actually very good questions, and right on time, because I'm going to talk about hopefully answer some of them. Can you see my screen, Andy?
I can, yeah.
Perfect. And on the breakout rooms, as Andy said, we can also open those questions for discussion. So I'm actually very excited to be talking about this part, and I'm gonna present to use two of the tools that our validation hub have been working on to aid you in the process of doing risk assessments. So this is an outline of what I'm gonna go through, and I'll start by setting the stage into what is a validated software. And this is not gonna be a formal definition, but more I wanna tell you about my intuition, and more importantly, we wanna set expectations for what these two tools that I'm gonna present actually do. And this part is gonna have some intersection with what Andy already said. So I'm gonna present then these tools. One of them is an R package called Risk Metric, and the other tool is a Shiny application that we name it the Risk Assessment Shiny application. And after I present them to you, I'm gonna go through an example of each. And in particular, I'll go very quickly through Risk Metric, and I'm gonna focus more on the Shiny application since that's going to be useful for the exercise at the end. So at the end, we're going to break into rooms, and we're going to measure the risk of some packages and answer some questions there. So let's start by talking about what is a validated software, right? So it's important to note that no statistical software can be purchased as pre-validated software. Rather, validation is entirely left to the end user to implement. So for example, the commonly used SaaS is not a pre-validated software, right? Now, what happens is that given that some of these statistical softwares have been widely used in the industry, many companies have collected evidence throughout a long period of time, detailing testing and validation procedures, so that instead of reinventing the wheel, what companies do, so instead of duplicating the testing, which has already been performed in the past, the companies, what they do is they make the decision to use these packages or these softwares based on their history of extensive previous use. So if you agree with these ideas, then the question comes why we can apply the same thought process for the use of our packages or the R software. We know that our packages have received validation through a variety of sources. Validation by the authors, namely like Howley Wickman or Max Kahn, by users of the package in the academia, and by users in a wide variety of industries like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, for example, by pharmaceutical companies, particularly preclinical, and by companies such as Mango Solutions, and even the FDA themselves have stated that they have been using R internally for some time now. So in the same process as a SaaS user will trust a long-standing SaaS package, we can start to think about our packages in the same way. So if we believe this to be the case, then the question we need to answer is, which R packages can we add to our safe list? And before going forward, I just want to know that this information appears very well explained on this paper here at the bottom. We are going to share the slides so you can take a look at them. So which package can we add to our safe list? When we think about which package we can add to our safe list, some questions come to mind, right? Questions like, is the package on CRAN? Does it have unit tests? And how well is the test coverage? How good is the test coverage? Does the package have any documentation? And even how many times it has been downloaded, right? And who are the authors? So we know famous some of them that are very famous. So we already know by looking at the authors if we can trust or not the package. So what RiskMetric does is it tries to answer these questions and more. RiskMetric is an R package that measures the risk of using R packages. And this risk is calculated based on metrics. And these metrics in turn evaluate development best practices, code documentation, development sustainability, community engagement, and so on. It's important to note that this risk does not represent the risk of damaging the system in which the package is installed. So RiskMetric doesn't do that, and doesn't directly tell you that the internal functions are correct, right? It does tell you that indirectly by looking at the unit test, by seeing the test coverage, and so on. So if, for example, we take RiskMetric and we apply it to ggplot2, we can see that that ggplot2 has a low risk, or a risk of 0.21. And if we apply it to a new package, and let's use the Stacks package. So the Stacks package is a new package being developed by the Tidy Models team. And the Tidy Models team is the group at RStudio that does our modeling our packages. And so this package is very new, so the risk is going to be high. It's not on CRAN yet. The risk is 0.9. And here risk 0 means no risk, and 1 is the highest risk possible. I don't know if you can hear me well. I'm not looking at the chat, sorry. So if you have any issues, please let me know. Let me come back. So if you have a package that has a very high risk, like a stacks of 0.9, the question is, does this mean we can use it, right? It has a high risk, so maybe we shouldn't be able to use it. And the question, of course, is not, you may be able to use it, you just have to look at probably what are the test coverage or other metrics that may shed more light into why that risk is so high. So then when we're looking at the risk, it is useful to have a space where we can not only look at the risk and at the metrics, but provide feedback on them. And that's where the Shine application can be useful. So the Shine application contains all the metrics of risk metric, and it will show you also the final risk. But it also contains features where you can provide feedback. So you can go and provide feedback on each of the metrics. It has all the advantages of using Shiny, right? You have a web application that you can interact and give you feedback, and you don't need to code or read our code. It can allow authorized personnel to comment on the metrics, and only those authorized personnel. And it saves the comments throughout the life of the application, so you can look back at previous comments. And it can serve as a reporting tool. So once you go through application, make your comments, you can output, the application can output a report for you where you can save the comments and the rest of the information that you have added to the application. So, and hopefully this can help you in the process of adopting a GxPR server in the future. So let me look at this chat for a minute to see if there are any questions. Okay, let me keep going. So let's take a look at an example using risk metric, right? So risk metric is the R package that I mentioned before. This R package is on GitHub. It's not yet on CRAN, but hopefully it'll be there soon. So let's go through an example. How will you use it? Since the package is on GitHub and not on CRAN yet, you need to use DevTool to install it. So it's under the Pharma GitHub repositories. So once you install it and you load the package, there are 3 main functions that you will call: pkg_ref or package reference, pkg_assess or package assess, and pkg score or package score. And the package reference, so to the package reference, you provide a list of packages, the ones that you want to measure the risk of. And package reference will look for the reference. So we'll look for information about these packages in CRAN or on GitHub, or even in your local, in the packages that are locally installed in your computer. So once package reference finds information about the packages that you gave it to, you can call the package assess function, which will create classes that will correspond to metrics, like how many times has the package been downloaded, and so it will scrape or split that information into the metrics. And then the package score will give you the risk and standardize each of these metrics, and it will put a value between 0 and 1 on them. So when you apply these functions in sequence and you output the result, you get a table, which is hard to read here. So I'm gonna show you a cleaner table. And for our case, we have ggplot and stacks. So you will get the package name, the version, and notice that by default we get the latest version, the risk, and how many downloads has had the package in the last year, what is the bug status of the last 30 metrics, of the last 30 issues, excuse me, and a bunch of other metrics as well. Notice something curious, and I left this on purpose, that when I started doing this presentation, the stacks package, the risk was very high, it was 0.9. But as we, as time passed, the package decreased the risk to 0.83, which makes sense since the package is in active development and we expect the risk to start going down. So now that we saw how RiskMetric will do the risk assessment, let me show you how you will do this using the risk assessment Shine application. And the code for the application is also on GitHub on the Pharma side links. So let me go ahead and share the screen of the application. So I'm going to stop share for a few seconds and share the other screen. Andy, can you see my screen? Let me see.
Yeah, it's just come through with the app now. Yeah.
You can see it?
Yep.
Perfect. So once you load the application, this is what you'll see. It has a login screen, and up here you can put your name, and this can be set up so that only people in particular roles can log into the application. So once you enter the application, you will see the upload package tab. And here you can upload a CSV file that should have this structure, package name and version. And once you upload it, and the package will appear in this list. So I already pre-uploaded some packages. And so let's take a look at ggplot, for example. So notice as I showed, ggplot, it selected the latest version of ggplot, which is 3.3.2. It showed me the risk. So the risk is pretty low, 0.21. And it also jumped to the tab maintenance metrics, where you can see some of the metrics that we just saw on the table. But this way is more informative. You know right away that it has been yet, and the news are current, and the source code is public, and where this risk metric found it, and so on. And so here you can leave comments. So for example, you can say, need to look further into the bulk closure metrics, right? And leave the comment, and that will stay with the side by side with the package. You can jump to the community usage metrics, which I guess is a pretty good one to take a look at. So here you can see the downloads of the last year per month of the package. So ggplot was downloaded 869,000 times on December 2019. Wow, and here 1,600,000. And you can see per month how many times it has been downloaded. Here on the top, you can see how many months it has passed since the last version, since the previous one, and yes, and how long has the package been outside, and so on. The testing metrics tab, which is still under implementation, once RiskMetric adds that to the package, we can add it here, which will portray what is the test coverage of the package. So another great thing about the application is that you can output reports. So once you go through the package and read the metrics and input your comments, you can get a report, download a report here, and you can share with others, and anything that you consider useful to do with the report. The application does have other features that we we may remove on the future. You can provide your own risk. You can say that the application has a high risk, for example, even though it portrays 0.21 here, and submit your decision and leave it that as a final decision and leave an overall comment. But I think that's mainly the things that we're gonna go through today, but feel free to play around with the application on the breakout room. So let me, I'm gonna stop sharing now and I'm gonna switch again back to the slides. Let me do that. Okay, perfect. So, okay. Andy, can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Perfect. So now let's go through an exercise together. And this is gonna be 15 minutes for the exercises. And this is what we're gonna do. So we're gonna break out into rooms, and each of you, so on the groups, your TA is gonna share with you a link to the Shiny application that you're gonna use. The application will have 3 packages already preloaded: dplyr, LME4, and BS Hazard. We expect you to be familiar with dplyr, with LME4, but not with BS Hazard, and that's okay. And what we would like you to do is to go over these questions. So we would like you to classify the packages by risk, so by in between low, medium, and high. We would like you to select which metrics were more important in your decision, and also we want to get you thinking about which other information will have helped you to reach your decision. So, for example, if we're making the decision, do you want to read the vignettes or Google out the authors, or have other metrics? And the last question that we would like you to answer is how would you go about reducing the risk if you needed to do that? So we're gonna have 15 minutes to go through the exercise, and then we're gonna come back, and in the last five minutes, let us discuss your findings, and your TA is gonna share the answer to those questions with us once we're back in the main room. What I wanna do now is I want to hear from the TAs and try to go over like how do you guys address the questions. So for the TAs, does anyone want to start? Go ahead, Eli.
Yeah, so to answer the questions, our group for the risk decided it was low, low, and then high, which I think might kind of be the expected answer for some of them. Some of the interesting conversations that we had was one of the things that we thought was pretty important that we haven't really thought of a metric for is how compatible it is with other packages. The example that was brought up was dplyr and plyr. If you have both of those loaded, they don't always play very nicely with each other. And I thought that was an interesting
point.
Yeah, an interesting thing that we haven't really talked much about. Otherwise, some of the major things that we talked about were, is there a public repository and a public site for bugs? So especially for BS Hazard, that was one of the major things, that there was no public GitHub page or any forum for bugs or anything like that. What else do we have here? Another question we had was, how would versions affect the risk of packages? So dplyr just went to version 1. So how could that affect the risk of that? And one interesting thing I found for LME4 was, how was validating or qualifying a statistical package different from any other package? And it didn't sound like there were a lot of differences there.
Yeah.
So I can stop there and let any other groups go with that.
That was great, Eli. Thank you. Did the other TAs find any other things that are different or worth mentioning?
Well, a couple comments. This is Kevin Anderson.
Hi, Kevin.
We also had a good discussion. And LME4, I think the comment came up that since it's statistical modeling, you should do some testing. So there was some discussion of whether to put that into medium. BS hazard, since I'm familiar with it, I mentioned some other things, which is that we're doing some internal testing at Merck on that to qualify for our own purposes and how to best use it if it's wanted. Also, then the question came up, well, if we did that, are we willing to share, the testing we did in some way? And I mentioned that there's some discussion about, having repositories at the our validation hub that could support, extra testing that somebody does if they share it. And then a couple things on the metrics. One, it said source code wasn't available, which you certainly can find the R source code. It does attach to some underlying C libraries, which are very broadly used, that it's not completely clear without reading the paper that they're there. So there are various things that you could be adding in the metrics in comments that might make you feel a little bit more comfortable about the package. But generally, I think it is still high risk, but it has some attractive capabilities and might be movable to lower risk with a reasonable amount of testing.
Yeah, I agree, Kevin. I think we can make tests, and as you said, make it a low risk package ourselves, even though risk metric gives you a high risk for that package.
Yeah, and one of the questions that came up was, how many companies that might be doing this would be actually willing to share testing that they do in the validation hub, if they go through that exercise to qualify something for their internal use.
Yeah, that would be amazing. It would be a good idea to put together testing in a place that we can all use it and modify it and make it better. I don't know if that's on the plans, but it's certainly a good idea.
I'm biting my tongue, but yeah, we will touch on it slightly in the next section. But yeah, absolutely, it's part of our plans. And just in case anyone has to leave sort of just before the next hour when we're finishing the workshop, yes, we are interested in getting people involved and in both developing a white paper around testing, and then once we have that, implementing a test framework that will allow everyone to contribute tests centrally. So we just need to establish how that's going to work and get it moving, really. So anyone who is interested in that, definitely contact us after the workshop.
I think there were quite a few interested people in breakout 4 because that's one of the topics that really dominated our discussion today. And so we also discussed the importance of adding additional tests and possibility how great it would be if we could share them, because it really seems like a win-win situation for many companies. And about sharing, an interesting point around what other information would help us to reach our decision is essentially breakout of users. So if for example, if we are from GSK and if we knew what kind of packages are considered to be low risk, what packages are used, in Pfizer or in other companies, if we could share this kind of information between ourselves, that would really help us evaluate the risk. Another bit of information that would help in the decision making around the risk is the deep dive into code, for example. So just looking at where the style of the code, whether it's well written, commented, consistent, unless it's written in C, and if the code is available, that's something some people on the call found important. And amongst the metrics which are already in the app that are important is, for example, whether the package is on CRAN. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Magda.
I think we had a very good productive discussion.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping for. To get you thinking and mostly about the next part about testing. I don't know if any other TA wants to share.
This is long. I think we also discuss about the dependency part. So how this getting together into the report and in the metric. So currently in the app, we can only see the selected package, right? And other than that, I think we agree all the good points we have been discussed. And we also have a little bit of time to discuss how those R can play a role in the general analysis and reporting for clinical trial, and also share some understanding for a large or small organization to qualify the package and its challenge.
That's good. Thanks, Elon.
This is Paul. A couple of comments from our group. One interesting possible metric is that was discussed was the stability of a package. Is functions are deprecated, they change, or they break, or whatever it is, and if there is a way for us to measure the stability of the package, how it's changing over different versions, would be like something interesting.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. One other question is, do we have the equation that we are currently using for the scoring somewhere?
So when you say scoring for the risk? For the risk,
yes.
We can share. We can share it with the. What I'll do, Paula, I'll put that on the site. But one comment around that direction is that when you're measuring a package, and I don't remember if I mentioned this in the slide, but the package score function, you can provide to that function a weight vector, so that, for example, if you don't want some of the metrics to count, say the package has a news file, maybe you don't really mind if the package has or not a news file, you can set the weight of that metric to 0. So that metric won't count in the final risk of the package. But yes, I'll put more information about that, Paolo, on the site. And it's the same site that everyone has access to, but I'll make sure that everyone has it after the workshop.
So as we discussed, I mean, the risk is always for you, right? It's for you, for your company, whatever you're interested in, and having this customization is great. It's excellent.
Exactly. Yes.
I think those are the key comments.
Let me see. So
yeah, from my breakout group, the discussion was mostly around bug closure percentage, and the discussion surrounded that the percentage may not be as informative without having the absolute number or the number of downloads or the release date. So how fast does actually the bug closure translate into a new stable version on Crown or on the GitHub or things like that. Okay. And then there was also the question whether it would be like, or it was mentioned that it would be useful to have more details on the metrics derivation of the different metrics. So whether that bug closure is actually just concerning GitHub issues that are generally issues, or if it is specifically issues that are flagged as a bug. But also there was the concern about the stability and how much those risk metrics can be influenced to make a package seem better in their quality than it actually is. And whether like certain metrics can be inflated more than others.
Okay.
Which was interesting.
So yeah, I just want to point out, Julian, that the application has a help button at the top where you can learn more about the metrics. But certainly maybe we have to make that more available on the application so people can read more about it. So I think we have run, we have used the time that we have for the discussion. Andy, do we still have time for a 5-minute break and go through the next section?
Yeah,
2 minutes?
I'm a supporter of breaks. So I think it's important that everyone gets them regularly. I'm simultaneously in another conference where I'm told that people only have an attention span of 15 minutes and then it dies. So let's have a break. Following that, thank you everyone for inputs. If anyone's got any further questions, I guess ping them in the chat, and then we'll get going with the last section of the course. In responding to risk, where we'll touch on a lot of the themes again in those 5 minutes time.
Okay, perfect. So I'll set the timer on the screen, and let's get a 5-minute break. So I'll see you in 5 minutes.
So hopefully most people are back from the breaks now. In this section, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we might respond to the risks that we've identified. There's a big warning here. Sorry for the frightening use of really, really bright red on this slide. But this is methodology under development. So some of you, I know, attended the workshop that we ran last year. And last year, that's at the Pharma conference course. And last year when we ran that, risk metric was in a prototype state. We had a sort of prototype app, and we tried that out, and we got some feedback, and that led to to a lot of features that we put into those over the following 12 months. Similarly, we can look at this with respect to testing as well. So there's some ideas here, but again, in the spirit of this workshop and the conversations you've had thus far in the breakout rooms, what we are looking for is input into some of the ideas that are here. So we're not telling you today this is definitely the way you have to do this, but it's current thinking, and we would very much welcome your input in that. Okay, so what's the situation? We've just performed our risk assessment, we've looked at our packages, and we've got some kind of classification, high, medium, low. And we're asking the question, what does this mean for us? And we know it's probably going to mean something around testing, but how we go about that, what level of testing, how we factor in the risk assessment are questions that we're going to try and answer. So I'm going to refer back now just to ICH E9 and just remind you of what the actual wording is. And this talks about the statistical software in the context that it should be reliable, and documentation of appropriate software testing procedures should be available. And of course, being regulatory guidance, the word appropriate is not well defined in ICH, in the ICH documentation. What I would say is actually, if you refer back to that EMA document from April, there is a little bit of guidance in the Q&A around what appropriate might mean in this, but generally it's still up to you to determine what you think an appropriate level of testing would be. Some of you may have come across this V model. I was umming whether to include it in the slides. V model is something used in validation more widely. There is a big caution with this in that if you search online, the terms validation and verification are often used synonymously, and that's not how they are used within this industry. So just be aware of that as you start to search. If you search models like this, that it might not mean what your corresponding regulatory body interprets it to mean. But essentially, this is a model that you can use to validate software. And it starts sort of at the top with user requirements, and you can see there's design, and each of these phases has a testing phase here as well. But in the open source world, we essentially have none of this. We may have elements of this V model from some of our more trusted resources, but at a bare minimum, all we're left with is code, and we have to try. We can't influence the development of the software, the design of the software, but we can do something on the testing, on the validation side. Okay, so we can define our own requirements and we can test against those requirements. But the first concept I'm going to put up here is that we might not need to. So I'm going to look at two scenarios. I'm going to look at low-risk packages and high-risk packages. And thankfully, from the exercise, it sounds like everyone came up with at least one low-risk and one high-risk package. And in some cases, certain groups looked at LME4 as a medium-risk package as well. I'm not going to really address medium because I think you need to address what low and high mean first before you can kind of get onto that middle case. But let's talk about low risk packages. So I've posed this this question on the slide, and I am looking for an element of discussion, but in a sense it's rhetorical. Is anyone using statistical analysis software today that they consider low risk? I am assuming that you are all using a very well-known commercial software, statistical analysis software, that you consider low risk in your organization. Okay. What I am interested in is to know, and you might not know this, but if you do know, either in the chat window or if you should have the ability to unmute yourselves, can anyone tell me any steps that they take to ensure SaaS? I'm going to be very blunt about it. It is SaaS that most of you are using. Anybody take any steps to ensure that that is reliable beyond simply trusting the qualification test provided by SaaS?
At the Fed Hutch, this is Kate Ospey, we do additional qualification or additional testing to make sure that expected functions work appropriately, sort of like specific analyses or procedures.
Great. How do you define those?
We take sort of basic requirements of sort of the scope of work that we do, and then we do sort of lightweight implementation tests on those. So we have a tester write a test case, and we execute it and record the expected and actual results of those.
Brilliant, thank you. Are most other people in that boat? Does anyone not write any additional tests, or does anyone just use the SaaS tests? Want to share that information? Okay. There's got some stuff in the chat window. Okay, so in essence, what the reason for I wanted to pose this question is, I would think about the base R distribution, or the core R base and recommended packages, and arguably you could consider the tidyverse in very much the same boat as SaaS in terms of the steps taken by the developers to ensure the reliability of the software. So if you're in the boat where you don't write anything else and you simply trust what the developers do for SaaS, then that's your company's position on risk, and I would challenge you, why don't you take that similar position on R? If, as in the example just given, okay, you do write additional tests in a kind of lightweight fashion, then I would say that's what you're going to need to do for R packages if they return as low risk. I guess the important point is it's down to your own risk aversion as to whether you want to follow that or not. And I've mentioned this EMA guidance. The EMA guidance talks about, and again, this is validation of computer systems, so you could also interpret this as not directly applicable to languages, but the sponsor may rely on qualification documentation provided by the vendor if they have assessed that as adequate, and their Q&A goes through what that might mean. So it might be that you can determine no additional testing is required, or some form of minimal testing is required for a low risk package. And to get you to think about that, I've talked about SaaS as an example. If you think about that in the R sense, I am young enough to have been taught R at university, or it may have been S+, my memory fades. But the Cox proportional hazards function, the Cox pH function, was how I was taught survival analysis, or how I was taught Cox proportional hazards specifically. And I was taught that in S+, and if you know the backstory of R, you'll know that R is based upon the S language. Essentially, it's a copy of the S language. So for many years, this function has been around, used, and taught. Almost synonymously with statistics comes the tools that you use for statistics. And because it's widely taught at universities around the world, it's widely referenced in literature, It's been established as part of CRAN for a long, long time. And it is covered by that regulatory guidance document that I mentioned earlier. It also has a number of existing tests that you can access. And one might argue that that is sufficient. If you can document all of that, you can go through your risk assessment, and part of that risk assessment might be running the risk metric package, and part of it might be stating some of what I've just put in on that screen as bullets. But if you can capture that information, put in a risk assessment, that might be sufficient, such that when an auditor comes in and asks you how you justify the use of that software, you can point to those references. If you're slightly more risk averse, what you might want to do is take some of those references in literature and write some checks so that you can qualify the language as well. Okay, and I put this up. In the interest of time, I'm not going to launch into a formal discussion, but I'd be really interested in the breakout rooms to hear this, or afterwards, about what people think about this statement, that tests should be written for all statistical modeling functions. So Paolo, John, and I put that statement in. It's one that I'm starting to challenge a little bit. I think in cases like something like the Cox proportional hazards function, there may be a case for not doing that, because if there are already tests there, if we trust the process, does it necessarily add value to write additional tests? Am I actually reducing risk? Okay, or am I doing it to tick a box somewhere? If you feel that you writing additional tests is helping further reduce the risk, then that's your approach to risk. By all means, I guess, go ahead with it. But if it's not something you do with other languages, other tools, then you might not need to. Okay, so that, first of all, that's just low risk, just to get you all to think about that, about whether you really need to go through that. For higher risk packages, we could classify a package as high risk for a number of different reasons, but it's likely that it's got some poor software development life cycle, or it's unknown. Okay, it's obscured from us. It's not out there in the open source. It probably, and this is probably one of the key ones that we would think about, it has no tests, no existing author tests that we can either use a metric like test coverage to assess, or I think one of the groups mentioned going in and diving into the detail of the tests. I think Magda, maybe that was your group. If there are no tests to look at, we're going to seriously question the development processes. So how do we go about ensuring reliability in that case? Well, as I mentioned, we can define some requirements and we can write some tests against those requirements. I don't want to go into too much detail around this, because I think the process for writing and requirements and defining requirements and writing tests against those requirements will depend on your own company's philosophy. I presented an example framework here. This is quite a well-known framework called the Moscow prioritization framework for requirements. Must, should, could, would. So if you're building software, you prioritize your requirements in this way. And it might be that for a must requirement, you expect 100% of those requirements to be met, but you allow some wiggle room around the shoulds, the coulds, and the woulds pretty much or won't. It might mean that it doesn't actually offer that functionality that you would desire. Okay, but crucially, it's all around how you intend on using the package. If you are going to qualify or validate that software for your usage, it's how you intend on using that package. Okay. In terms of then developing tests against those requirements, okay, so that requirement might be I must be able to fit a linear model to use the Moscow framework, or it could be I must be able to subset my data by row or by column, as in the case of something like dplyr. Whatever your requirements and however you go about defining those requirements, you've then got to go and start writing some tests against those requirements. And the key questions that come up with a risk assessment are, well, how many requirements do I need to write tests against to be sure? And how many tests do I need against each of those requirements? And again, a lot of that's going to depend on your own organization's aversion to risk. Okay. But crucially, with respect to accuracy, reproducibility, and traceability, what we're looking at for testing is to test the accuracy. Okay, the reproducibility, traceability is pretty straightforward to capture, and we can develop tests that we just rerun. We can simulate some random data and check that once installed, we can recreate that same random data. But really, we should be we should be focusing our tests around accuracy or correctness. And I want to draw your attention to that because it may well be obvious that we should be testing for correctness or testing for accuracy, but there are a lot of misconceptions around what that really means. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes just making sure that everyone's on the same page and define this. So this is my first, I think we're, 2 hours, 20 minutes into this workshop, and this is the first Wikipedia quote or first reference found through Wikipedia. But functional correctness refers to the input-output behavior of the algorithm. In other words, it doesn't necessarily require us to go and review the code. So it's not an in-depth review. And if you think about other commercial software, it's unlikely you would be able to review the code for commercial software. And again, I always try and think, when I'm thinking about R and how I approach an R package, I try and take the same approach as a commercial software, because the type of license, whether it's open source or closed source, doesn't matter much in terms of the way the software is built. We might get more comfort if we're paying someone some money for some software, but otherwise, there's no reason why there has to be a difference between the two. So if you think closed source software, you're not going to be able to review the code. And if you're building an application, typically you would test that by saying that if I click this button, I expect this plot to be created. How that gets created, the stuff that happens underneath, doesn't matter so much in your test scripts. So the point here is that for accuracy, if we know what the expected result is, we don't necessarily need to review the code. Okay. So I've got a really simple example here, just to emphasize this point, using the mean function. So if I'm writing a simple test for the mean of the numbers 1 to 3, I can use this as test that syntax, and we'll briefly touch upon test that in a second. But I can use this to say I'm expecting that the mean of the numbers 1 to 3 is 2, and that's a really easy thing to verify. We know that the numbers 1 to 3, the mean of the numbers 1 to 3 is 2. What is perhaps less easy to verify is if you randomly simulate numbers. This, in some sense, can be used to further check that a function performs as expected, but it's really, really difficult to verify by a human. So the only way that you could do this is by make this work is if you could generate this in, say, another software that you do trust, and check against that software, either being a calculator or SAS or whatever it is that you trust. But if you imagine this scenario, I've set a seed, I've generated 100 random numbers, and I'm saying expect equal mean of those 100 numbers and this. Now I've pre-calculated this to work out that that is correct. That is the mean of the numbers that I would generate in that. And if you've got an R session, you can by all means go and check that. But an auditor, and I've spent a little bit of time with our audit teams internally at GSK recently, but if an auditor comes in and asks you, how do you know that this number is the expected result? It's going to be pretty difficult to justify. So that's a very simple example of the mean, but where it really, really matters is with statistical models. So here's an example test of what I think is a good test for a linear model. So again, it's using the test that framework, and I will explain this a little bit more. But if you ignore the test that bits around it for the moment, if you're not familiar with it, what we've got here at the top that I've just highlighted is a data set that we're creating, and we're creating it based on some published data from a book on generalized linear models. So we're referencing this directly back to literature and saying, in this published model, which has been through peer review, thereby further reducing the risk, I'm going to fit a model and check that the results I get are the same as what we can see on table 6.4 on page 97 of that published resource. And that is a much, much better test than if I were to just randomly generate or use something inbuilt like the air quality data set or IRIS or something in R, and then write a test against that. So for me, the important thing is making sure that we've got example cases. And I know that I can see lots of questions coming in. I'm unable to kind of, with time, sort of address them all. But I know there were some questions before around simulating example data sets. And I do think as an industry, if we could, if we did simulate some data sets, show that show that if we fit certain types of models to those data sets, we have expected results. However we do that, if we compare them to literature, if we calculate it by hand, if we use SAS even to verify those, and I think if we could get that source set of data sets to compare to, that would really, really help us all in testing. And I'd be really willing to, if anyone's interested in talking about that afterwards, really willing to talk to you about that. Okay, for today and for the exercise that's going to pretty much bring us to a close on this, we have built a test framework using test that. Looking at the time, we might have to cut the exercise down a little bit on this, but I do want to give you a chance to go to RStudio Cloud and have a go at this within your breakout rooms. So test that, if you don't know, is the most common unit testing framework for R today. There is another unit testing framework called RUnit, and there's one called SVUnit as well, but they're pretty rarely used these days. Test that by far and away is the most popular one. The test that is really designed to work with our packages, so it's meant for authors to include tests within their package, but you can use it in a kind of open scripted way as well. And you can see, you've seen on the last couple of slides some of the examples of that. So in the current version of test that, and I'll come on to that in a second, what you would do is you load the library, and within a test script, you define some kind of high-level description, some kind of context for what you're trying to test. And then individual tests look like this. So you have this test that statement, explain what it is you're testing, and then you can write one or more tests in this expect underscore format. So there are lots of functions in test that that all begin expect underscore. So there's things like expect error, expect warning, expect equal, expect equivalent to, and so on for various different cases. And essentially your fine level tests are these expect functions, but you can group them together in these test that statements and within context, within individual files with this context here to provide a kind of hierarchy to do with your testing. Okay. One caveat, Hadley Wickham released there was a webinar with RStudio, I think towards the end of August, sometime in August, where he announced test that 3 is coming. And Stefan has rightly pointed out that contexts are deprecated within test that version 3. So the only difference between what we're going to do today, where we're using test that 2 and the test that version 3, is that in test that 3, the context is becoming the file name essentially. So the idea within test that is you name each file, as your context, and therefore you don't need that context statement anymore. So that's where test that is heading for version 3. But for today, we don't have that functionality, and we're just going to use we're going to use context in the example code. Okay. At this point, I'm going to try and switch to a demo, and I suspect that RStudio Cloud, it's still live, which is good. Okay, if you, I did post a link at the start of today, and you should have been sent it in advance of the course as well to RStudio Cloud, but we'll reshare when it gets to the exercise. But you should each have your own RStudio Cloud instance that you can log into. Within that instance, what you'll find is you have a bunch of files already preloaded for you in a project, and one of those files is this help HTML, and I'm just going to open that in the browser for a second. So for those of you who have not used test that before, hopefully I've given you the impression it's relatively straightforward to use. I'm not sure why that's taken so long to load. We'll come back to that in a second. There we go. I thought it might have timed out, and it has. Okay, let's try that again. Okay. So hopefully you can see this now. So I've provided a brief testing guide. Mostly this is taken directly from the R packages book by Hadley, where he talks about testing. But you can see this kind of structure that's outlined within this. In particular, I mentioned there are all these expect functions. Here's a list of all of the expect functions that you can expect to find. So you can do things like expect S3 class and so on if you want, expect true, expect warning. anything that you would want to test is kind of in there. Okay. And you can see there are some examples in here as well around things like expect equal, expect identical, and how that might differ, okay, where you're adding sort of small numbers in this case. So expect equal is, if you like, more of an approximation in this case, because I'm adding a very, very tiny number, but I expect identical is doing exactly what it says. It expects those answers to be completely identical. And there's also things like expect equivalent as well, where it's going to ignore any kind of attributes in the naming as well. So in this case, I've shown an example of if you compare a data frame and a tibble, which are otherwise exactly the same, apart from one's a data frame and one's a tibble, expect equal will fail and expect equivalent will pass. So there's tests to sort of match the level of rigor that you need. Okay. So all that's in your RStudio Cloud project. And the main thing that's set up for you is a test stats report. Okay. Thanks to Emma Martin, who's unable to join us today. She was going to be one of the TAs, but she helped set up this framework. And I've just sort of post-processed it a little bit. What you have within test stat is I've created for you a test stat folder. And in that folder, you will see you have, you won't have this LM test, okay, but you will have test rec 01 and test rec 02. So these are example files that follow this test stat structure, okay. So in this case, we're looking at dplyr, and we're testing whether we can subset by specified columns, okay. So there's a very simple test that says if I take a very small data set based on the air quality data set, and I select the wind and temp columns from that data set, then these are the named columns that I get back, and only these. And a similar example where I do the same but using numerical referencing. So very, very straightforward, simple, couple of straightforward, simple tests that have been put into there. What we've built for you is a framework that takes tests that are in a test stat directory. So you can see here we've got various different test scripts within that directory. And then we've built this R Markdown report, which if I click knit, will go away, execute the tests within those directories, and build a test report. So in this case, I've got 7 tests in total. 6 of them passed, 1 of them failed, and I've got a pass rate here, 86%. I've got some details of the environment, the execution environment for those tests. I've got the test cases, the files that are executed, and then I've got the fine level summary. And this is the last bit that I want to just make you aware of that we've put in place for this workshop. So in here, what we've done is we've put in a mechanism whereby if I go to the test requirement for a second, what we've done is we've used the context, and as was pointed out earlier, context has been deprecated, so in future we would look to use the file name for this. But we've specified the requirement by a number that we might have, and then the actual requirement itself. And what happens is when this runs, there's just a little bit of parsing of that string, and it just separates it out into a requirement ID down here. If you look at the detailed test summary, requirement ID and the requirement, so we can split these things out and get back fine level summaries. And then I think it's off the bottom of my screens for you, so let me just scroll down. And then in this case, this is me playing around locally. I've managed to break the functionality where it reports back the failures. But theoretically, it will also report back the failures as well. Never tweak an example before a workshop. It always turns out badly. Okay, so that's the framework that we have built for you, and we'd like you to use in a second. We haven't got the full time that I was going to allocate to this, so let's go for a 15-minute exercise. What we're going to do is go back into the breakout groups. I showed you those examples with dplyr. We're going to imagine that we're working with a package called Risky dplyr, which is my attempt at humor. And basically risky dplyr is just the dplyr package, because hopefully you all know it really, really well, and we wanted to find a package that you knew and could write tests for quite easily. But let's imagine that we didn't trust it. Let's imagine that it, you know, Hadley didn't put it through, and all of the other contributors didn't put it through a good software development life cycle. There was no code on GitHub, and so on. It scored badly in some of its metrics. And so we've decided, for whatever reason, we want to write some tests for it. So what I want you to do is, let's imagine that scenario in your groups. And you can go into our Studio Cloud and do this and write it out and test out the framework if you want to. Or if you just want to discuss it in your groups, that's absolutely fine. But discuss, what would you define as your requirements? Okay, so something's coming out maybe as a medium risk. How are we going to define those requirements? And then what kind of tests are we going to write? And most importantly, how extensive are you going to write those tests? Because afterwards, what I want to do is just pull everyone back for a very, very brief discussion, and understand how you are thinking of factoring in the risk score into this. Okay. Hopefully that made some sense. If I've rushed through it a little bit, your TAs are on hand to explain that a little further. But if you go through that exercise, hopefully you've now also got the links if you didn't have it before. Otherwise, Marley, I'm going to need to go to you to kick off the exercise, if that's all right. Okay, I'm going to assume that's critical mass back in the workshop. Thanks everyone for running through that. In the interest of time, I'm not going to follow up and on the discussion now. I'm going to speak to the TAs afterwards and get your thoughts, their feedback. And obviously, if anyone wants to contact us after the workshop, you're willing to, please do, and give us your thoughts, especially if you want to get involved. And I'll put up details of how to do that again later. So hopefully you can see my screen. Okay. So let's get a discussion. One question that often comes up, and I imagine came up in the discussions that you had, was around how many tests is the right number of tests, particularly if you want to respond to a risk assessment. So the diagram below, again, is a work in progress. This isn't any kind of official documentation, anything like that. This is just an idea at the moment that we'll be discussing over the coming weeks through the R Validation Hub. But all it's really implying is a feedback for testing. So if you have something that's maybe a medium risk, once you've created your first couple of tests and executed those tests, and if they've come back successfully, you would expect that already in that kind of iterative approach, your perception of the package has changed somewhat. Okay. For example, Marley mentioned the risk score of a new package going down. Well, if something is in continuous development, if the package author starts adding more tests to their package, then that's going to lower the risk that you assign that package. So why not if you do the same thing as well? So there might be some mechanism whereby you say, we're going to create some iterative strategy where we're going to test a sample of functions, or we're going to strategically target certain functions that we're going to use and generate, I don't know, 5 tests, 10 tests, 15 tests, whatever it is, a low number of tests to start with. If all of those pass, that might be sufficient to lower the risk. If they fail, then there's that might be grounds already to reject the package. But essentially, you try and build up your expectations iteratively. Or it might be that you test the key functions, then you move on and start testing some of the further functions. But try and build something that adapts to that risk. That's a proposal we'll try and work on after the workshop. So inputs on and thoughts on that would very much be welcome. I've mentioned test that. So I'm just going to basically finish. Actually, I'm going to skip this as well and finish with a brief summary of today and just how you can get in touch. So we've discussed how you might implement a risk-based approach, and we've touched on testing, and apologies that we didn't quite get to do everything we wanted to do around testing, but hopefully in the breakout rooms you've had a good chance to have a play with a potential framework, have a discussion, and you've noticed that if I write a package, you're immediately giving it a higher risk score because my framework that I added to broke and didn't work properly because I didn't sufficiently test any of that framework. So I'm very well aware of that irony. Hopefully this has answered some questions. I said we're not here to answer questions, but hopefully it's answered some questions. Hopefully it's given you some food for thought in terms of how you might go about approaching this if it's something that you was completely new to you. Hopefully, if you are someone who has started looking at this question already, the conversations that you've had within the breakout rooms, learning from other companies, has also helped with your thinking as well. Next steps are really up to you. So we are looking for support from the R Validation Hub. We're looking for volunteers. Clearly, we were talking about the kinds of metrics that we might be interested in today. We are still expanding out the risk metric package and the risk assessment app. So we are interested in people who can, either with the Shiny experience or with our knowledge generally, to look at risk metric and help for those. The testing bit, as I said, is an unknown. We're looking for someone who can write better R code than I can to help develop a standardized testing framework. And I think that came up in the first discussions as well, that lots of people would like to come together and share tests. So that's very much going to be a priority for us moving forward. And before we do, we obviously just want to build some kind of brief white paper, or at least put a page on the website that's going to outline our thinking around that. So anyone particularly interested in testing philosophy and thoughts on how we would do this as well, please let us know. So you can contact us by emailing this address. This comes into two people, Lynn Taylor and I. Lynn's much better at checking it than I am. We might give out, and you'll have our direct email addresses after the course, so you can email me or you can email Marley if you're interested in something, or one of the other TAs as well. Okay, or if you're just interested in monitoring what's going on, then by all means, please do join our mailing list, and we'll let you know when there's new blog posts and things coming out as well. Okay. Otherwise, 1 minute to go. Thank you to Marley for helping me with this workshop, and thanks to the R Validation Hub for their support in the rest of the R Validation Hub for their support in building all these tools that Marley and I have been talking about, and especially thanks to our TAs. I hope I've got everyone. I feel like I've missed someone. Marley, could you? Is there a name missing that I've missed?
Well, the organizers of the conference were asking us to do this workshop. It has been a great experience. I guess those were the only ones you were missing.
Yes, yes. So as it says on that, yeah, thank you to the conference organizers as well. Okay, and thank you all for participating in the workshop and providing us with the valuable feedback. That is the end of the workshop, just about on time. Thanks to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day if you're based the other side of the Atlantic, and have a good night's sleep if you're on this side of the Atlantic, or India, somewhere like that. All right. Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank
Bye,
you,
thanks.
guys.
Bye.